All right, so we're looking at Old Testament resources. And so we've talked about introduction, survey. This book here by Merrill, Kingdom of Priests, History of Old Testament Israel. Again, if you're teaching the historical books, I definitely would want you to consider using that as a textbook. Definitely a college and or seminary level textbook. And so it starts off with the origins of Israel, a section on the Exodus, conquest of Canaan, the era of the judges, Saul, David, the divided monarchy after Solomon, dynasty of Jehu. So he just sort of traces through the whole history of Israel, including Assyria, the exile, the Babylonian exile, and the restoration. So if you're looking for a good, detailed, really could serve Old Testament survey as well, at least at the master's level. And then this is one by Howard and Grisante, the Giving the Sense, Understanding and Using Old Testament Historical Texts. And so they are the editors. So you have, if you're dealing with Old Testament survey and or Israel's history, here's some of the titles. History as History, The Search for Meaning, History or Story, Literary Dimensions and Narrative Texts, Archaeology and Biblical History, that's Eugene Merrill's chapter, History and Theology, C. Hassel Bullock, Overview of Israel's History, what really happened during the Exodus Judges period, United Monarchy, Archaeological and Literary Issues. So again, a book that's going to give you some more detail than you would find in a survey book. So it's called Giving the Sense. And going into even more detail at the definitely master's level and probably going into the PhD level here, Kitchen's book on the reliability of the Old Testament. That's K.A. Kitchen, produced by Erdmans. And so, yeah, it deals with the so it goes into more of the archaeological context, but just the evidence for various individuals mentioned throughout the Old Testament, and you know, going into detail on like Edom and Moab, chronology deals with that issue. So very helpful text. And then some of the older ones here, Wood, Survey of Israel's History. Let me mention Arnold and Byer's book. So if you're looking to read translations of primary sources, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, we get into Atrahasis, Gilgamesh Epic. So for the Pentateuch, for instance, creation, the flood is the first chapter, and they've got translation of Eridu Genesis. So some of the Babylonian and Akkadian, the Epic of Atrahasis, you get the translation of that. Gives you a summary from Lambert and Millard's book, and then their translation. So you can read the English translation of the Akkadian there. You also have a Pneuma Elish on page 31. So again, if you wanted to read a translation, at least have some idea of what how scholars translate these important sources. If you're doing some type of comparative work, with Genesis and the ancient Babylonian accounts. They also have from Faulkner's book, Ancient Egyptian Pyramid Texts. What does Egypt say about creation and the flood? You have the Epic of Gilgamesh, page 66, a translation of that. So they have other literature that relates to the ancient Near East. They have a section on covenants and treaties, Mari covenant ritual. So if you wanted to get into the background literature regarding covenant, this would be an excellent book to read as well. You get into the Assyrian laws, the Hittite laws, Hammurabi, Neo-Babylonian laws, cultic texts relating to Egyptian religion, and then some of the things we'll be talking about later when we look at Old Testament archaeology. They have the translation of the Cyrus cylinder, the Sumerian king list on page 150. All right, so that's readings from the ancient Near East. So helpful book if you want to know something about background material. One that I did not put on the list here, I'm going to add, is by Alfred Horth and Mattingly and Yamauchi, Peoples of the Old Testament World. Peoples of the Old Testament World. So, talking about the various Gentile nations, for instance, part 1 on Mesopotamia, Walter Bodine, a chapter on the Sumerians. Bill Arnold did a chapter on the Babylonians, chapter on the Assyrians. Yamauchi is focused on ancient Persia, chapter on the Persians. And then in part 2, you get the Hittites, the Canaanites, Arameans, Philistines, Egyptians, James Hoffmeyer's chapter on the Egyptians, the Ammonites, Edomites, Moabites. So you have chapters dealing with the peoples of the Old Testament. So again, helpful background information. You would also probably get some of that with the encyclopedias as well. So getting into ancient Near East. Oh, I did put that one down. Peoples of the Old Testament World. Yamauchi's book, Persia and the Bible. So if you're going to study, for instance, the book of Esther, if you were going to study Nehemiah, you would want to get Yamauchi's book, especially to understand the background. It'll help you when you teach those books as well. Now, as we get into the Hebrew Bible, so hopefully you've still reviewing your Hebrew, your Bible, and we're going to talk about the Tanakh. And for instance, cohort 1, they're right now into the former prophets. They already dealt with the Torah in their first class, but they've been focusing on Samuel right now. So you have the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, right? The law, the prophets, and the writings. And yeah, so call this the Tanakh. As you know, 22 books in the Hebrew Bible equals the 39 books in our English Old Testament. One verse I wanted to look at here in Luke chapter 24, story of Jesus, first of all, with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. after they told him about what happened that weekend, and actually it happened all to Jesus, Jesus said in verse 25, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So it's interesting, Jesus, in referencing the Old Testament, describes it as starting with Moses. Of course, we believe that Moses is the author of the Torah, and then all the prophets. So sometimes the Old Testament is referred to as the law and the prophets. And then when he meets with the disciples in the upper room, he said to them, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was with you, that all things need to be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses." Now he adds the phrase law of Moses, and the prophets, and the Psalms concerning me. So it's interesting. You have a threefold division of the Old Testament here. Jesus references that. And the very first book of the Ketuvim is the book of Psalms, right? So the writings. So Jesus, it's interesting in referencing here the law, the prophets, and then Psalms is the first of the third section. Ecclesiastes, the Hebrew title, Kohelet there. And we'll talk about Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit later on, but the oldest copies of our Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so it's important, I think, to look at those and to do some comparative type study, especially as you get into your Hebrew Bible exegesis classes. And so we're talking about the website. If you've not looked at it yet, the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scroll site. It's a great site to look at the exact photo images of fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the complete Isaiah scroll. I know one of our PhD students, Stephen Mapes, in cohort 1, is looking at the servant songs in Isaiah, especially as they focus on Messiah. And so he's had access to be able to look here at the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scroll site. So very interesting book there, the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, oldest known Bible translated for the first time into English. So we have approximately 200 biblical scrolls, fragments of scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so what they've tried to do with this is look at those scrolls and fragments and basically translate and put down what has been seen in terms of those texts in English. So if you're interested in looking at that, it's very helpful, especially if you were looking at the biblical scrolls on the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scroll site. Could be a nice little guide for you as you look at those fragments or scrolls and then compare it with the English translation. So just for those who are doing some study, exegetical work in the Hebrew Bible, it's always helpful to look and see how other people have translated as well. Now we come to the Aleppo Codex, and at the break here, I might get out, get a chance to see how big. We have a facsimile of that here at Calvary's library. Right now, it's in my office. The Aleppo Codex is from 930, AD 930, okay? So it's a Masoretic text, so it's going to have The it's going to have the vowel points. It's going to it's important to see that it's an incomplete Masoretic text. So initially, this Masoretic text came from Tiberias in Israel. There was a rabbinical school there. Basically does not include the Torah. So the Torah that was a part of this codex apparently burned in the synagogue when it was there in Aleppo, which is in Syria. And so that part was burned up, but the rest of it was saved from the fire. And it is the oldest of the Masoretic texts that we currently possess. So again, when you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls being 200 BC to about AD 68, that's when Qumran was destroyed by the Romans. You're at least 1,000 years removed from the Qumran community, Dead Sea Scrolls, to the Aleppo Codex. As it is sad that we don't have, for instance, Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus there in the Aleppo Codex. So the Masoretic text is written in 3 columns. And you can see that here. You see the 3 columns here. So we have the Torah Scroll here. We have columns. This is called a line. So there's no verse reference. There's no chapter reference. You go by column and by line number, and then word reference. So between the columns and in the margin is what we call the Masora Parva, the small Masora, marginal notes written by the Masoretes. And at the top and bottom of the pages is the Masora Magna, the large Masora, which lists entire passages, sort of like a cross-reference system put together by the Masoretes. So you can see here in the margins be the Masora Parva, and then here at the bottom and at the top, the Masora Magna. So you'll be learning more about this hopefully in your Hebrew exegesis class, especially as you get into your study of the book of Jonah. Just a reminder, that's the book that you'll be studying next. So if you want to get a head start in your Hebrew exegesis class, you can start doing that. So we're looking at the Hebrew Bible and textual history a little bit here. And so we come to Codex Leningrandanus, which is, notice, 1008. So we had Aleppo of 930. So about 78, 80 years later, we have the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Masoretic text, Codex Leningrandanus, which is the basis of our modern Hebrew Bible. So hopefully you have some copy of this, Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the Scholars Edition here, of the Masoretic text. And one of the great things that, in having the Torah Scroll here at Calvary, and I hope if you ever come to Calvary, make sure you stop by my office. I'll get the scroll out so you get a chance to see it. But the Torah Scroll that we have here at Calvary dates to about 1900. All right, so the cool thing about it is that it's a Ashkenazi Torah Scroll, so it's from Eastern Germany, Europe region, survived the Holocaust. So that's a cool thing. And then it came to Israel. So a Jew who survived the Holocaust, as you know, 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. The Jew that survived brought that Torah Scroll to Israel, was in the basement, Geniza, of a man by the name of Ben David. That's pretty cool. And was purchased by a group, God's Ancient Library. So they're the ones that donated the Torah Scroll to Calvary. So a few years ago, I flew up to Minneapolis, and we were gifted the Torah Scroll, and we were able to bring that back. And if you look at the website, Calvary, have a picture of the Torah Scroll there. So Biblica Hebraica Quinta, there are some new works being done by scholars on the Hebrew Bible, and one of which is the Biblica Hebraica Quinta. There's another one called the Hebrew University Bible, the Oxford Hebrew Bible. So I posted in Canvas for you today an article by David Baker, which is called "Which Hebrew Bible" is the title of it. Which Hebrew Bible? And so the first page, it talks about Biblica Hebraica, the series. How did we come to where we are today? It has a whole section on Quinta here. They talk about the Masorah, the critical apparatus, give you some detailed information there. Then you have the Hebrew University Bible, HUB, tells about the text for that, the Masorah, the critical apparatus, and then the Oxford Hebrew Bible, OHB, talks about the project, the text, again, and so you get some details about the Masorah and the critical apparatus. So to give you detail, this is an article from Tyndale Bulletin, Which Hebrew Bible. So you can see that scholars are continuing to do the analysis there, looking at the text. And so just as we have some debate and discussion about which Greek New Testament text, the received text, critical text. So we have some debate and discussion regarding the Hebrew Bible as well. So another book that is being worked on here by a number of scholars editing this is called the Textual History of the Bible, THB. And so just some amazing scholars here working on this. And so just looking at the sort of a summary of it, I'll see if I can get a copy of this posted for you in Canvas. But they have scholars who are working on each one of the books of the Hebrew Bible and looking at the textual history for each of those books. And then also looking at primary translations. For instance, Emmanuel Toff is writing on the Septuagint, the Targum, Syriac Peshitta, Vulgate, Arab translations, Coptic, Ethiopic, Armenian. So just all kinds of work being done on the various translations of the Hebrew Bible. And they're tracing basically the history there. So for each book, for instance, I'm assuming this is a volume here. For Proverbs, they deal with the textual history, the ancient Hebrew text of Proverbs, the primary translations, secondary translations. So they're doing that for all the books of the Bible, Hebrew Bible. And then, let's see. For instance, the textual history of Koheleth would be, if you were studying Ecclesiastes, you would want to get a copy of that, like the earliest developments, Hebrew text, So it deals with all details regarding textual criticism, comparing texts. You get into variants, including variants from Qumran. All right, so a very helpful series of books. It's going to be a series called The Textual History of the Bible. So I know, Jacob, you're looking at the canon, so you might be interested in a book like that, or the series of books. Maybe you can get it through interlibrary loan. Brill. It's going to be a very expensive series, but might be helpful in terms of looking at what people are saying about canonicity. Now, as we get into the grammars, Pratico and Pelt, the third edition here, Basics of Biblical Hebrew, has been sort of a standard Hebrew grammar, but there are others. I took Dr. Ross, Alan Ross, at DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, and the book that he wrote, Introducing Biblical Hebrew, was really that course that I took with him. So if you're looking for a good book, a reference grammar to review your Hebrew, I'd like to recommend that. Walke and O'Connor, Introduction to Biblical Hebrew Syntax. Get into looking at the words and phrases in and sentences. Seow, Grammar for Biblical Hebrew, Revised Edition. These are some of the reference grammars. Now, as we move into Hebrew English lexicons, Hebrew theological dictionaries, we get into word studies. Your lexicons and dictionaries and concordances are going to be helpful. I want to talk about Hebrew helps, as well as Old Testament Hebrew exegesis, textual criticism, and biblical theology. We're going to spend a whole day talking about biblical theology, historical theology, systematic theology. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I thought at least I'd put it in this section here. So for lexicons, again, if you have accordance or logos, you might want to have one of these lexicons. It makes it a lot easier to to right click and be able to look at a definition. You can put your lexicons, link it to your Hebrew text. But Halot here, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, Kohler and Baumgartner, the study edition here, probably the best lexicon available today. BDB is the one I went to school back in the 80s. That's what we were using, Brown, Driver, Briggs. And then you have Holiday, Concise Hebrew and Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament. One of the things I wanted to mention to you is the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. How many of you have seen or used this? Anybody?
I've seen it.
All right, this is a 5-volume set. So this is what you want to ask for your birthday or for Christmas, right? Right. This is a 5-volume set. And the great thing about this, the old dictionary would use the English words up at the top. Now the new one here that's edited by Van Gemeren has just the Hebrew words, right? So you need to know the Hebrew alphabet to be able to look up the words. But for instance, volume 1 is Aleph through Zion. Okay, so whatever word starts with Aleph, you would find it here, and so it does start from the front of the book and go, to the end of the book. Unlike your Hebrew Bible, where you start at the back and then you have to move forward. So, but you have it in Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. You have it in that order. to be able to look up the words. So for each word, for instance, you have the ancient Near East cognate. It tells you like if there's Ugaritic, Akkadian, Arabic, Ethiopic translation. Then you have the Old Testament usage of the word. You have the bibliography that's given for each one. So I think they had a section on the, just looking here at the word for Aretz, which is earth or land. For instance, how they break that down, they have earth, page 519. They have it the land, divine ownership of the land, divine gift of the land, land in the covenant relationship. And they have a nice bibliography for other articles and books. So about 5 or 6 pages just on Aretz there. So you're going to find much more information here for word studies. And so this is the standard for word studies now in Hebrew studies. So you should be aware of that. Just as Silva is for the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis, and they've redone that as well, so it follows the Greek words they're at the top, just as you have the Hebrew words here. So you should be aware of that if you're doing any type of word study for exegesis classes. This is the book. These are the books that you want to get. So I think it's a total of like 10 volumes, like 5 for each. So then you have the Old Testament Hebrew concordances that if you wanted to look up a word, and rather than using the Hebrew ones, I like to use the Hebrew English one. This is a little bit easier for me, but it does give you the places where that word is used in the Hebrew Bible. And then if you get into some other Hebrew helps, let me mention, how many of you have heard of Owens Analytical Key to the Old Testament? Anybody have that book?
Yeah, I think I do have that one.
Okay, so Owens, did I put my hands on it here? Oh, here it is. So this is a 4-volume set. Owens here, 4-volume set. It goes through every word in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and so the great thing about it, it's a translation guide. So if you're looking for help in translating your Hebrew, of course you can use a coordinates or logos. But the great thing about this, if you take a 3x5 card, you can put the 3x5 card over the parsing and the definitions of the words, and it just goes down word by word, each word for each verse of the Hebrew Bible. So like Bereshit, bara, Elohim, et hashamayim, et haaretz, right? So if you put a 3x5 card over there, you'd look at Bereshit and say, what does that mean? And then you could slide it down and you would see that, in the beginning, it's a preposition, it's a construct. It gives you a page number, I think, in one of the BDB lexicon. And then when you get down to bara, it'll parse it, cal perfect, third masculine singular, created, right? So it actually goes through each word and gives you the parsing. And so that's in a hard copy, right? If you didn't want to use your biblical language software there, Accordance or Logos. And so if you want to learn your vocabulary, review that vocabulary guide to biblical Hebrew, Pelt, and Praticos there. So your required texts for your upcoming Hebrew Old Testament class, Exegesis in the Hebrew Old Testament, is the book by Douglas Stewart, Old Testament Exegesis, a handbook for students and pastors. That's the 4th edition. I just have a 2nd edition. And then I don't have your 2nd one. That's by Tucker. It's called Jonah, Handbook on the Hebrew Text. That's the Baylor University Press series. So you'll be going through Jonah. So some steps in Hebrew Bible exegesis. You'll be talking more about this. So it's sort of an introduction to get you started. Reading the Old Testament book through in English is always a good start to preparing a message or a series of messages, sermons, or lectures. And then looking at your Old Testament introduction and survey books to see what they have to say about the historical background. So I always like to start there and then get into the translation of the book. Your textual criticism, I'll show you some tools for that here in a minute. One of the books that we're using in our Hebrew Bible classes is Dorsey's book on the literary structure of the Old Testament. So if you're not familiar with Dorsey, encourage you to get that. It will help you to see how the Old Testament books are structured. And talk a little bit about chiasm and how that's being used in the Hebrew Bible. And then to make an exegetical outline of each Old Testament book. Now that's always a good goal because it forces you to think through the relationship of the various sentences and paragraphs and how you would outline a particular narrative. And we get into this quite a bit in the exegesis to exposition class. And we talk about how do you go about doing that? The main points, the sub-points, how they need to be descriptive of the content of a particular chapter or book. Selecting the keywords for your lexical analysis and doing the word studies. And we referenced the sources here, especially Halot and the Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. Consulting commentaries and journals. Hopefully you got a good start on that this week, finding some journal articles. Your verse-by-verse exposition. Your biblical theology of the Old Testament book is really the key. You know, what does the book teach us about God? What does it teach us about man and the relationship between God and man? How does this book relate to Israel, especially from a dispensational perspective? And then writing out the applications. How does this Old Testament book originally designed for Israel, how does it relate to the church? Some books that deal with specifically for exegesis. Let me just mention another one since Joel is not using this book for his class. But if you wanted to get ready, this would be a real good book to read even this week. From Exegesis to Exposition, a practical guide to using biblical Hebrew. And this is by Bob Chisholm. So, you know, it's one thing to translate. It's another to go from translating to coming up with a sermon and or lecture based upon the Hebrew text. So he actually goes through and shows you step by step how to do that. And he starts off with the tools that we're talking about here. The basic question, the most basic question of all, what is the text? And I mentioned there that book, you know, which Hebrew Bible, that article. Getting down to nuts and bolts, the basics of Hebrew syntax. Beyond the sentence, the basic structure of Hebrew narrative and poetry. Getting beneath the surface, narrative and poetry as literature. The exegetical method outlined and illustrated, making it contemporary, crossing the bridge from exegesis to exposition. So again, this book will help you learn how to use your biblical Hebrew Bible. Now, some books that will specifically relate to interpretation. I don't have the first one, but I do have the one by Chisholm here, Interpreting the Historical Books, Exegetical Handbook. So these handbooks here put out by Craig are very, very helpful. You have a timeline, has a section on what is narrative literature, interpreting narrative texts, from text to application, the themes of the historical books. So this is going to be specific things to look for as you begin to read and study different types of literature, right? Like interpreting the wisdom books. I think, Lou, that you were looking at that, especially Schultz there, Futato. I don't have the wisdom one. I have interpreting the Psalms, the Exegetical Handbook. Grisanti on the prophets, interpreting the prophetic books. So if you were going to study those books, it would be helpful to look at these. They're called Handbooks for Old Testament Exegesis. They're going to give you some things to look for as you read and study these books. And again, these are just another tool to add to your toolbox. So as we finish up our first hour, Hebrew Bible exegesis, talk a little bit about textual criticism here. Put that. Well, some books here on textual criticism. See if I can find my handout here. I thought I had it here. I probably put it somewhere else. Okay, so yeah, let me show you Dorsey's book while I'm thinking about it here. This is a book that you'll be using in your Hebrew Bible classes, called The Literary Structure of the Old Testament by Dorsey. It's put out by Baker. And so, yeah, so what it does is it talks about literary units, arrangement of the units in a book, and then it goes through looking at different books of the Old Testament, and it gives you summaries, talks a little bit about chiastic structure. I think you'll find it to be a very, very helpful book. You'll be using it in your classes. Now, a couple books for Old Testament textual criticism, looking especially at the apparatus. We talked about the Masorah, Parva, and Magnum. Old Testament textual criticism here by Brotzman, Practical Introduction. Talk about writing in the ancient Near East. Has a chapter on the Dead Sea Scrolls, scribal errors, the practice of textual criticism, and then a textual commentary on the book of Ruth. Chris Johnson's working on Ruth. I should tell him about that chapter if he's not aware of it. He's looking at the Masoretic accents in the book of Ruth. So that's interesting. Here's another book, Textual Criticism of the Old Testament by Klein. And then more of a basic introduction to understand textual criticism in the Old and New Testament by Wagner, Student's Guide to Textual Criticism. And then dealing just with the text of the Old Testament, we were talking about that. The Masoretic text, there's a whole section on that. The Septuagint, other versions, Aramaic Targums, and it actually has pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls, various archaeological finds, the text of the Old Testament by Werthwein. All right, so again, as you get into looking at the Hebrew Bible, looking specifically at the oldest Hebrew Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, Aleppo Codex, Leningradus, then understanding the textual apparatus in Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia. These are books that can help you with that. Now, we'll talk more about biblical theology later, but I don't want to miss Kaiser's toward an Old Testament theology and Zook, Merrill, and Bach's book, Biblical Theology of the Old Testament by Moody. All right, so understanding that theology is important. All right, any questions or comments on what we looked at so far? Hebrew Bible, Hebrew exegesis, those sources. All right, so when we come back, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to go into the Septuagint, talk about that. Old Testament Apocrypha, right? So we're looking at sources other than the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, and rabbinic literature. We get into Talmud and Mishnah and all that. So we'll take about a 6-minute break, and I'll see you about 7:02, 7:03. Okay, we'll see you then. my mic back on here. Welcome back. I'll give you a chance to share something that a source that you read this past week that you found to be helpful. Maybe something that you found that maybe helped you with your narrowing your topic or coming up with your thesis or your dissertation proposal. So anybody would like to share?
Well, I read several articles in a series about what was called paratextual considerations. So it was paratextual in how specifically the books of the Bible have been ordered by different things. And that obviously ties into the difference between the way the Jews had the order generally as opposed to the modern English Bible. So it was good background, and we'll see if I end up being able to use it to some degree. It was a very specific topic, but I found it helpful to go through. It was like 6 or 7 articles done over the last 15 years by the same guy. So.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, so I've had some trouble with. I have probably more of a question with mine, just trying to see what your thoughts would be. But when it comes to the journal articles, I find a lot more journals dealing with Black liberation theology in South Africa as opposed to in America, and so I'm wondering, since it's kind of still a different context, would those still be helpful? I mean, I read through some, but I ignored a lot when it said South Africa. So I was like, let me not look at those. But I'm having trouble finding journals. I'm finding a lot of books, but as far as journals with that subject, just wondering, would you think that South Africa ones would be helpful as well?
No, it wouldn't hurt to read 2 or 3 of those just to see what they're saying, and be interesting to compare that with American context. So just for your own understanding all the different issues and see if there's comparative issues or not. I think that would be helpful for you.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I did find, like I have found a few that were like really, really good, and some that led me to other books as well.
How about websites?
Websites has been a little bit easier. I finally found a website where it's actually critiquing Black liberation theology, which is what I'm looking for. I'm trying to find the other side of the argument. So
Okay.
yeah, the websites have been a bit more helpful.
Yeah, website can include a blog, or any posts like that. Somebody has something that they're doing, and don't forget even when we talk about websites that may include a podcast. So don't neglect that in your research as well. Especially might find something that's from a sermon or something where somebody's preaching something.
Oh, okay, that's helpful. Okay, thank you.
Don't want to leave that communication out as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I've had a lot easier time finding stuff, journal articles related to the portion of John that I really am interested in. One real helpful one, I'm going to forget the guy's name. He just did a very good job of surveying actually what the disparate understandings of John's purpose are, going all the way across Orthodox, Roman Catholic, sacramental theologies, and even into some cults. I mean, how does it? Latter-day Saints actually believe that, John is still walking around the earth somehow, somewhere. So, unique, because I've only really ever considered there's probably 2 or 3 options. So that was impressive. One that was interesting that I read also was very recent, actually, by Thomas, or John, excuse me. Would you even say that name? Thomas Cuddy Johnson. And it was a correlation, kind of an allegorical interpretation of John in light of COVID, and how you would interpret it that way and correlate. So that was an interesting attempt at correlating the last discourse to COVID. It reminded me, Frank, actually, of when I had an anthropology professor that took it wasn't Black liberation theology, but it was South American liberation theology, with similar basis. And it reminded me of how they treat Moses as a representative of all freedom movements, essential liberation movements, except Jesus was both the chief leper and the one who heals in this article. I was just, me. Well, these guys know me. I find some weird stuff, and that one, but you have to interact with that actually, because it is an actual, I forget even who published it, but it's in a German theological journal, some note. And so that was an interesting interaction.
Anything, Yahweh?
Yeah, I found the articles give me more direction, kind of helped me to narrow down my topic a little bit more. This is I'm more thinking about the creation speech from Job. I think it's 38 to 42. How that answered the question of Job. I found there's several articles on that topic, and it is helpful. I found also I read several book reviews, which gives me better understanding of some books that I need to go further to dig more.
Okay. Well, that's a real blessing for you, especially because you've been sort of circling into what your topic's going to be, right? So you start with the broader wisdom books, and then you talked about creation theme in wisdom books, and now you're looking at Job, and now you're looking at a particular text in Job, and so that the whole process of a literature review can really help to narrow the topic, to get it down to where you would like to study it. So I'm glad to see you're finding some direction there. And as we go into finding more sources, as you read more, hopefully that's going to help you to come up with your outline for your proposal. And so, as you're reading sources, you're thinking about research questions that you need to really read various sources to find the answers to, and then you're also beginning to think about your outline. Okay, so of course the outline can change, your dissertation outline can change, but as you start off with writing chapters, you have to make a decision up front. You're going to have a literature review chapter in your dissertation or not. So you will be doing that for your proposal, sort of deciding on one of those approaches. Is it going to be a chronological approach to the literature review? So you look at the order, chronological order, date of writing, books and journal articles? Are you doing a thematic or topical approach? So you need to begin to think in those ways, especially as you begin to divide your sources out, and begin to think about the outline for your dissertation proposal, which will then be reflected in your dissertation itself. Now, what we're trying to do tonight and next week and the week after, we're getting into sources, hopefully that as you begin to take different classes in the program here, you'll at least be aware of these sources, and then as you work on research papers, these are some sources that you can use in your study. So we're looking at Old Testament Hebrew tonight, and when we talk about the Septuagint, of course, we're talking about the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so we start with Ralph's Septuaginta there. So hopefully you have access to that, or at least in Logos or Accordance. Would be very, very helpful for you if you're doing an Old Testament exegetical paper to have the Old Testament Hebrew text, and then next to it the Septuagint, right? So you can actually look at one of the earliest translations, can we say, and a translation is an interpretation. You can look at that and look at the Greek especially, and then as you get into the use of Old Testament in the New Testament, we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Many of the New Testament writers, of course, quoted from the Septuagint. So for Septuagint studies, we don't have a class here at Calvary in the Septuagint. So if you've never really studied it in depth, or this is the book that you would want to read. It's called Invitation to the Septuagint by Karen Jobes, Moises Silva. And so looking at the chapters here in this book, we have the history of the Septuagint, the origin, transmission, the Septuagint in biblical studies, using the Septuagint for textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, Septuagint and the New Testament. We said New Testament authors quoted the Septuagint. Septuagint scholars, current studies in linguistic research. So this is the book that you'd want to get. So, excuse me. If you start reading the Septuagint, again, the book by Karen Jobes, Discovering the Septuagint, a guided reader. It's going to help you with vocabulary. It's going to parse keywords, especially the verbs. So this will be sort of a guide to help you in your translation. So as you get into Jonah, get a drink of water here. As you get into Jonah, you want to look at the text of the Septuagint, see what they have there for Jonah as well. The LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, done by Jewish scribes in Alexandria, Egypt, during the reign of Ptolemy II of Philadelphia. So notice 284 to 247 BC. Places it in the 400 years after the completion of the Hebrew Bible. And the story of the origin of the Septuagint is found in the letter of Aristeas, 170 BC. So the Septuagint in many ways is like a commentary, so you don't want to neglect it, because it tells you what Jews were thinking as they read the Hebrew Bible. Let's look at Bene Elohim, right? The sons of God there in Genesis 6:2, translated with angelos in the LXX, right? So here we have evidence, early evidence that sons of God, at least 200 BC, was viewed as angels by Jewish scribes. Very interesting. And then in Joshua 4:24, the hand or yod of the Lord, Adonai, is translated the power of the Lord. Man, get a cough here. To avoid the anthropomorphism there in Joshua 4:24. So we recognize the apostles quoted in the Greek New Testament, the Septuagint. So again, another reason to read and study it. Then you get into problem texts like Isaiah 7:14, the Hebrew word alma, translated Parthenos, right? So the word Parthenos refers to a young woman who was also a virgin. It's the same word used by Matthew to describe Mary in Matthew 1:23. So she did not know or have a sexual relationship with Joseph. So here we see that, at least for the writers of the Septuagint, they're using a pretty strong Greek word Parthenos, which actually is used by Matthew. And I think an argument against the young woman translation, I believe it's in the RSV. Now, there were several recensions of the Septuagint, so not all the Septuagint translations were the same. Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, several recensions there. And then the famous Origen's Hexapla, which contained these recensions, also have his literal transliteration of the Hebrew letters of the Old Testament into Greek. Of course, we don't currently possess the Hexapla. It'd be great if we did, but it's important, I think, for us to recognize the recensions there.
And what does recension exactly mean? Like, it sounds like it's versions. Is that kind of what it's meant by that?
Yes. Yeah, so they're looking at the Hebrew text, and they're looking at the whatever copy they had of the LXX, and then if there were things that they agreed or disagreed with, they might change a particular Greek word and how they are translating the Hebrew, or as they look at the Greek, that may lead them, as they do some work. Like Hexapla was really, he's looking at all three of them, and then he's also doing a transliteration, the actual looking at Hebrew letters and transliterating those into Greek letters. So the word itself wouldn't make any sense, but it shows us, gives us an idea that at least he was looking at some Hebrew text.
All right, thank you.
So in doing word studies, as you know, you want to study how that Greek word is used throughout the Septuagint. So the 2-volume Hatch and Redpath concordance here, the big volume, is what you would want to look at if you're doing a study of a particular word. like Parthenos. You would do a study of the word as it's used in the Septuagint, see if there's any other places where it's found. Of course, you would want to look at New Testament, Koine Greek usage of the word. So we'll get it more into Greek next week, but start there in terms of your word study. That's why I said if you're going to do exegetical work, you want to look and see what the Septuagint says about a Hebrew text. The next book, as we get into the Apocrypha, introducing the Apocrypha, we talk about Old Testament Apocrypha, New Testament Apocrypha. Of course, these books were rejected by the Protestant Church, accepted by the Catholic Church, as we call the deuterocanonical books. So the Apocrypha, a collection of Jewish writings produced during the Second Temple period. Second Temple, that is, the temple was built after the return from the Babylonian exile. And they provide insight into the history and religion of the Jews in the period between the Testaments. We get into talking about Second Temple Judaism, right, which is a very important background to the New Testament. And I'll go back and get our textbook here. So the great thing about the textbook that you're going to be reading from Ancient Texts for New Testament Studies is this is we talk about primary source would be the Apocrypha. And this book is a secondary source, right? So Dr. Evans read the primary source and he wrote summaries of each one of these apocryphal books. And then he has a bibliography, which would be your tertiary source. So this book is a secondary and tertiary source to read the primary source, the Apocrypha. So what I'm encouraging you to do this week is to not just read Evans, but actually read some apocryphal books, okay? So get you into reading the primary books. Now I'm not asking you to read them in, Greek, right? But I am asking you to read the English translation, and I've posted some links in Canvas for you to do that. And get you into the rabbinic literature as well. We'll be talking about that. So a chance to do some reading in some literature that you've never done before. So the Apocrypha, the word itself means hidden. This Apocrypha is written in Greek, included in the Septuagint, okay, but was not recognized by the Jews as being canonical. Accepted by the Roman Catholic Church as canonical. So 15 books are sometimes called deuterocanonical or second canon. These books were rejected by Protestants because of historical and theological errors. So again, that would be of worth just to read it to see if you can find, what are those historic and theological errors that you could recognize. I'll just give you some summary here. And your textbook you'll be reading this week basically is pages 9 through 25. So he gives you short summaries of each one of these books, tries to link them to the Old Testament books if there's links, like First Esdras. He's going to link that to Ezra and Second Chronicles. All right, so he tells you his general method in his first chapter, and then as you get into the summaries here, he's going to also give you the bibliography for each one. So First Esdras, called Third Esdras by the Roman Catholics, has parallel accounts, right, with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So it'd be interesting to see if you did the study there, in what ways are they parallel? What information has been added or deleted? Now, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, definitely, if you're want to understand the New Testament, you have to understand intertestamental history. You need to read First Maccabees. If you've never read it, you should read it. Okay, it gives us insight into the history of the struggle of the Maccabees with the Seleucid rulers. That's the rulers of ancient Syria, in the Jewish fight for independence, especially focusing on Antiochus IV, who was a type of the Antichrist. So, Daniel himself and his prophecy references this time period. So that's important to recognize that. You've all heard the story of how he put a stop to the sacrifices in the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar to desecrate the temple. And that really is a type of the future Antichrist, who will put a stop to the sacrificial system of a tribulation temple. And he will also, as you know, the false prophet, we're told in Revelation, sets up the idol image of the Antichrist there in the temple. And so you had something similar happening during the time of Antiochus. So again, that's sort of interesting if you're interested in not only in intertestamental history, to understand what happened during that time, but also how that relates to biblical prophecy as well. So we start off with the groupings, historical writings, and then the religious legends. Tobit, the story of a pious Jewish blind man who receives his sight. Judith, the story of a Jewish widow who saves her city from Nebuchadnezzar's invasion by cutting off the head of a Babylonian general, Judith. And then Susanna, sometimes this book is referred to as Daniel 13. All right, so it's actually been added to the book of Daniel. Daniel delivers Susanna from death. He proves that the charges of adultery against her are false. And then Bel and the Dragon, sometimes called Daniel 14. Daniel exposed the folly of idolatry. He reveals how the priests came at night to get the food that had been offered to the idol Bel. And the story of the dragon reveals that Daniel fed the dragon something that caused him to explode. Sort of a funny story there. Daniel's placed in a lion's den, but Habakkuk comes and feeds him while he is there. So again, some extra biblical story there about Daniel. Then you get into the wisdom literature. Ecclesiasticus, called the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. The book is Proverbs, similar to the book of Proverbs. Baruch, supposedly the writings of the scribe of Jeremiah to encourage Jews. Right, so Jeremiah refers to Baruch. And then the letter of Jeremiah, which is also called Baruch chapter 6, supposedly a letter written by Jeremiah to the Jews carried away as captives to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Again, it's included in the Roman Catholic Bible as the final chapter of the book of Baruch. So the book of Baruch is chapters 1 through 5. The letter of Jeremiah is Baruch chapter 6 in the Roman Catholic Bible. Looking at wisdom literature of the Apocrypha, the prayer of Manasseh, wicked king, includes his penitential prayer. He did repent of sin as idolatry. Then we have additions to Esther. So additional 6 chapters in the book of Esther in the Septuagint. So again, if you read Esther and then you read this, it'd be interesting to see what's been added to the book of Esther. Prologue that describes a dream by Mordecai. The contents of the decree against the Jews, the prayers for God's intervention intervention offered by Mordecai and Esther, an expansion of a scene in which Esther appears before the king, a copy of the decree in favor of the Jews, and a text in which Mordecai interprets his dream from the prologue. So these are some additions to the book of Esther. And then we have the Apocalypse. So again, if you were studying apocalyptic literature, literature that is talking about the second coming of Messiah, you'd want to read Second Esdras, okay? So it encourages Jews to anticipate a Messiah. And it is an apocalypse consisting of 7 revelations. So it'd be interesting to compare Second Esdras, with prophetic books. That'd be interesting paper. Compare Second Esdras with the book of Revelation. Let's see what kind of information is being given in that book regarding the future. So Darrell Bach has written a book, very good books, called Jesus in Context. He says the books of the Apocrypha are important because they show us how Jews of the Greek and Hasmonean eras tried to make sense of their faith, how they attempted to express the importance of the role of the law, and the nature of Israel's hope in a period just preceding Jesus. Right? So these texts give us a window into how certain strands of Judaism tried to make sense of their faith, especially at a time when Jewish identity was under pressure from other national groups. We talk about the times of the Gentiles, Israel being dominated by Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, during the times of the Gentiles, persecution of the Jews. We saw that in First Maccabees. You see that in the book of Esther during the time of Persia. All right, let's move to the next type of literature. And again, I've given you some links in Canvas. Go to week 4 modules. You'll find links. In your book that you'll be reading, the textbook, page 26 to page 75, the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Okay, you're going to find summaries of these pseudepigraphal books. Here, Charles Worth, the editor of a series of books that will give you the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. So pseudo, false, graphe, writings. So they're false writings. They're attributed to someone who did not write them in reality. Rejected as canonical, not written by Old Testament prophets. Again, like the Apocrypha, they contain historical errors, false teaching. So we have apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. And again, it'd be interesting to read these and see what do they say about the future, right? So especially interesting when you see this is Second Temple Judaism literature. This is literature that was familiar with Qumran. We find pseudepigrapha at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So understanding this literature is important. There are various testaments. And again, you'll be reading the summaries. I'm not putting those up there for you tonight. They're expansions. I mentioned the letter of Aristeas explains the origins of the Septuagint. You might want to read that story of how supposedly the Septuagint was written. Be interesting if you're studying Genesis, life of Adam and Eve. All right, so Lou, you might want to look at that, especially as it relates to creation. Ladder of Jacob, that'd be interesting, dealing with Genesis there. Anybody know who Jannes and Jambres were?
Supposedly the Egyptian magicians.
That's right, Egyptian magicians there who opposed Moses and Aaron. Anybody know the Rechabites? They were the teetotalers of the Old Testament. They made a commitment to not drink wine. So that goes back to what? Nazirite vow, right? Number 6. Now we get into 3rd and 4th Maccabees, included in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. You got Psalms, Psalms of Solomon, more Psalms of David. Well, did David actually write more Psalms that were not part of the canon? That, I think, Jacob, that would be interesting for you because you're dealing with what's included in the canon and what's not. So Psalms of Solomon, we know, I think there's at least 2 Psalms that Solomon wrote. Did he write more? How would you know whether Solomon's the author or not the author if that's going to be disputed? Or Odes of Solomon. We have the Song of Solomon, and now you have Odes, plural, of Solomon. Now we know that Solomon wrote more than one song. I think he wrote quite a few songs, if I remember right, from 1 Kings. So you have, here's some other ones. You got into homiletics, or if you got into exegesis, Aristeas the exegete, be interesting to read about that. So again, Bach says this literature was not always widely circulated, but it does reflect what some Jewish groups were thinking at various times about important religious issues. It helps us to appreciate complexity and concerns of Judaism at this time. In fact, this literature shows that Judaism was not monolithic. It means everybody just didn't think the same way. Of course, we know that, right? We had Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes, right? So you had different groups in the time of Jesus. But there were many substreams and strands, and particularly important among these books are the apocalyptic or eschatologically oriented works like 1st Enoch, 4 Ezra, and the Psalms of Solomon. Now, 1st Enoch, I think, wasn't that the one that's quoted in Jude?
Yep, that's right. At least
So
usually identified.
Yeah, that would be a good book for you to read this week.
Mm-hmm.
So any questions on Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha, because I go to the Dead Sea Scrolls next? Questions or comments? And again, I tried to post some links to these sources for you. You're going to be reading the summaries, secondary source, right? Tertiary source. Let's go to Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me find my stuff on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, here we go. Well, one summer during my PhD program, we were encouraged to select a topic to do research in. And so I selected Dead Sea Scrolls and did quite a bit of research on the scrolls, and I've posted some of my research for you in some papers posted there in week 4. So just talk a little bit about those. One of the reasons I got excited, I had the chance to go to Qumran, also visit the Shrine of the Book, and saw some of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments there. So DSS, the Dead Sea Scrolls, are the writings of a Jewish sect. Debate about that. Was it the Essenes or not, who lived in Qumran, which is located on the northwest side of the Dead Sea. They're written about 250 BC to AD 68. Right, so whoever copied these scrolls were doing that during the time of Jesus. They're hidden in caves near Qumran. The Romans came, they destroyed, as you know, they destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, led by Titus and the Romans. But they destroyed Qumran, and then you have the story of Masada. Many of the people who lived in Qumran probably went to Masada. Read that story there. The mass suicide that the Jews did so that they would not fall into the hands of the Romans. So we have 900 documents. I mentioned this book here, the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. So oldest known Bible translated into English. So again, for each book, I'm just looking here at Genesis, all right? So I've got Genesis 1. And so it tells you, for instance, if a word is italicized, it has a footnote, and it tells you which source, which fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls it's found in. So sometimes there'll be information that's put in brackets, which means that that those lines or those words were not found in the Dead Sea Scroll itself. That's the reason why they're put in brackets like that. So it doesn't have all the verses for chapter 5, just maybe like one or two. Does it have chapter 6? No, it doesn't have chapter 6 verses, the sons of God. It just starts off with chapter 6, verse 13. So again, not all the verses from Genesis are found in the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So there's Jerusalem, Qumran, Jericho, Bethlehem, Masada. Get an idea where Qumran is located there. It's in the desert, very close to the Dead Sea. Here's the ruins of Qumran. They found a scriptorium there. I've written an article that I posted for you on the archaeology of Qumran. I won't take the time to read through that, but I talk about the Qumran excavations. I talked about what was found in Cave 1 and Cave 4, the Qumran cemetery, the scriptorium, the mikvah, which was the ritual bath that the Jews had. They would go down into the water, self-immersion, and come out the other side, and they did that prior to their communal meals. I talk about life in Qumran, a couple articles here, the doctrine of the community. I look at Damascus document. I look about the history of the community. I talk about the identity of the community. I look at the various views. Were the people in Qumran, were they Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots? I look at all these different views. Some even said early Christian sect, tradition. Josephus sees them as Essenes. Philo talks about the Essenes. So I talk about what's been discovered, Pliny the Elder, Philo, and Josephus, what they said about the Essenes. And I'll also look at the Damascus document. So what I learned about the Qumran community, what they practiced. Sort of interesting in comparing that community with the early church, especially in Jerusalem, sharing of possessions. There's a view from Qumran to Cave 1. So I have a paper on the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, it was 1947 that the shepherd Muhammad found cave 1 with the clay jars. They call those scroll jars, with 7 scrolls, including the complete Isaiah scroll. Notice how they reference. You should probably learn that. For instance, 1Q, 1 refers to cave 1. Q is Qumran, and then Isaiah. So that 1Q Isaiah, that's the abbreviation, stands for the complete Isaiah scroll. Notice there's an incomplete Isaiah scroll, which is B. The commentary on Habakkuk, sometimes called the Habakkuk Pesher. That's why you have the P. Well, I'll talk about Pesher here in a minute. But you have 1 means it was found in cave 1. Q is Qumran. P stands for Pesher, and HAB is for Habakkuk. All right, so I have an article which I read, the Habakkuk Pesher, and then I wrote an article on the doctrine of the Bible. So that is how did the Qumran community view the Bible? What was their Bible? The rule of the community, 1QS. The Thanksgiving hymns, 1QH. The War Scroll, 1QM. Genesis Apocryphon, 1Q Ep Gen. So the 7 scrolls, the main scrolls found in cave 1. Here's the Bedouin who claimed to discover they found these scrolls. I tell about the history of the discovery in 1947, how Kondo buys the scrolls from Muhammad. Talk about Professor Sukenik, who worked for Hebrew University there in Jerusalem. And this is how the nation of Israel came to obtain the scrolls. So 1947, Sukenik, now think about that. This is right before Israel was declared to be a nation. Purchased the scrolls in Bethlehem just before Israel will fight for their independence. Israel became a nation in 1948. So here's the scroll jar, what they look like. So you can go to the website. I've given you the link to see the great Isaiah scroll for yourself. You can compare. That would be an interesting study to compare the Isaiah scroll with our modern Hebrew Bible or with Aleppo Codex, just to see, are there any textual issues? So doing those type of comparative studies. So Randall Price, if you're looking for a good introduction, I recommend Randall Price, Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The number of Old Testament manuscripts discovered at the Dead Sea, 223 to 233, is more than twice the number of New Testament Greek papyri, 96. However, despite the abundance of the ancient witnesses to the text of the Bible, few English translations of the Old Testament have been effective. The reason is that generally the biblical Qumran text are so close to the Hebrew text behind the Masoretic text, the MT, that they lend support to rather than amend these versions that rely upon the Masoretic text. What it does show us that for over 1,000 years, the Hebrew Bible was carefully copied by scribes, right? So they knew the middle word, the middle letter of the Torah, for instance. Those who expected the scrolls to produce a radical revision of the Bible have been disappointed. These texts have only verified the reliability and stability of the Old Testament, that is its text, as it appears in our modern translations. So here's cave 4, 15,000 fragments. So there are more fragments than there are scrolls. When we talk about the scrolls, we have to recognize that there were very few intact scrolls. Many believe that cave 4 was a library for Qumran. Qumran ruins very close to cave 4. 1954, Yagil Yadin comes to America and purchases 4 scrolls for Israel in America. So there was an ad. Can you imagine that? Wall Street Journal there ad, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. And it said this would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. So secretly, Yagil Yadin purchased these 4 scrolls and got them back to Israel, 1954. Fascinating story. Some other very fascinating things. The copper scrolls are these ancient treasure maps. 1956, they're cut open by Manchester University in England. There's a list of temple treasures buried at various sites, never been found. I'm sure a lot of people have tried to translate those and try to find out where the temple treasures are. Like Indiana Jones, maybe it'll be you. If you go to Jerusalem, you want to make sure you go to the Shrine of the Book Museum. See how it looks like the top of the scroll jar. That's how they designed the museum to look. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves are in a basement vault down below, but you do get to see their facsimiles. So that's inside the Shrine of the Book, the Great Isaiah Scroll in the middle. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scroll site, right? So you can go online, you can check out. The cool thing about it, you can if you have your computer, you can enlarge it so you can actually look carefully at letter or word. So that's a really cool feature. This site. So using the world's most advanced imaging technology, digital library preserves thousands of scroll fragments, including the oldest known copies of biblical texts, now accessible to the public for the very first time. So you can examine the high-resolution spectral images of manuscript copies, and you can learn about the scrolls and what they're trying to do to preserve them as well. So you can check out my research. I posted some articles there for you. My research on Qumran. All right, it's about 5 of 8. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So let's come back at 8 o'clock. And we're going to talk about studying the Old Testament from a Messianic Jewish perspective and how important that is before we get into the rabbinic literature. 5 minutes. All right, so going back to your textbook, you'll be reading this week, Dead Sea Scrolls, start on page 76, and he goes all the way to 154. All right, so got a lot of summaries there of various Dead Sea Scrolls, and it also gets into Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, so that'd be interesting. You know, what does Qumran have to say about that? The Targumim, we're going to talk about that. All right, so two more books on the Dead Sea Scrolls before I finish here. Here's a book that I was reading that summer, Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. All right, so again, this is by Geza Vermes, a Jew. So again, if you look at a particular scroll on the Leon Levy site, which I didn't have access back when I was studying, which you have access to now, if you had a book like this, you could actually look at the Hebrew text, and then you could look at the English translation right here. So that would be very helpful if you wanted to study a particular text. It's going to help you with the translation on there. And then a book that gives you a lot of information about Dead Sea Scrolls. It's going to be a textbook in the upcoming Bible archaeology and historical geography class. Is James Vanderkam, professor at Notre Dame, his book, The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, so very, very good book. Going to have got about 4 chapters on the Dead Sea Scrolls in Scripture. For instance, one chapter is the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament before the scrolls. Second chapter, the biblical scrolls and the text of the Hebrew Bible. Chapter 7 will relate to your topic there, Jacob, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the canon of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And then chapter 8, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha in the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, so it's going to give you more detailed information than you're going to find in your textbook. The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Vanderkam. All right, so before we get into the rabbinic literature, I just want to mention studying the Old Testament Hebrew Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And so there are quite a few different Jewish evangelism type ministries out there. I'm just mentioning 2 tonight, Ariel Ministries and Friends of Israel. And just want to mention a few books, some of which you'll be using in class, upcoming classes. Talk a little bit about Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of Ariel Ministries. Encourage you to go to their website. My article, The Messiah and the Torah, they published a real nice magazine article in the December issue of Ariel magazine. I was very happy to get that published with them. Also had it published in our Interdisciplinary Journal of Biblical Authority. So any research paper or book review that you do here for Calvary, I want to encourage you to send Mike Dodds if you would like to get it published with our journal. Mike is always looking for book reviews, and he's also looking for articles as well. But Dr. Fruchtenbaum, you'll be reading one of his books later on. It's called Israelology, The Missing Link in Systematic Theology. We're including that as a textbook. Here's a book if you're in. Yes, go ahead. I can't hear you, Josh.
I'm sorry, I was going to say Israelology is a huge book.
Like you went blank. Everybody, did my computer go bad? Oh, it did.
Can you guys hear? Anybody hear me? No?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, Josh. I'm hearing you, Dr. Gramacki, too.
I don't know.
Yeah, I hear you both.
I don't know. Anyway, if you don't have it, it's a big book.
Nope, he's dropping out.
Every once
Hey,
in a while,
Todd,
his headset drops it, you know, but
do you recommend that book? Do you like that book?
it's a good book. I don't use it. I don't, well, I have read it, but it's been a long time. It's more of a reference thing for me. And man, if they've got it on Logos now, get it on Logos.
They do.
Or Accordance or whatever, something that has a search engine, because it's a dense book.
Okay.
For Logos, which one is like the best subscription to get? I know there's like different versions of Pro 9 or whatever it's called, but which one do you think is kind of, which one do you guys have?
I don't know what mine correlates to. I bought it a long time ago. It was a Scholars something package that they offered when I was at Dallas. And I've just been adding to it. But I'm not even familiar with the new packages.
There's so many of them, but there is academic ones specifically. So like that's where I would tend to start is the, you know, and they have a basic academic version that they'll give you for free too, if you just, you know, send them the sheet from Calvary saying that you've got it. So for our purposes, that at least hopefully that would get some of the language stuff, you know, right from the get-go. But yeah.
Okay. And that was part of that email you sent too.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take a look at that because there were so many packages. I'm like, I don't know which one to get.
They've added a lot of variety that they didn't used to have. I mean, it used to be either like the ice cream at Jason's Deli. You get vanilla or chocolate or mixed. That was it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Frank. Once you decided to go to purchase, you can talk to them. They can give you big discount. When I purchased mine, I talked to a guy. So you want to get like everything in the front, they will give you a bigger discount.
Okay. Yeah, because I bought the package back when we had Hebrew, but every time I go in there to find sources, it just doesn't have enough in there. So I'm like, I need to get something with more sources in it.
Well, I'm back.
Are you back? Can you hear me now? All I was saying is it's a huge book. Dr. Fruchtenbaum, you know, poured a lot into it.
Yeah, he did. I think, are we still recording? Yeah, I guess we are. Okay.
Looks like it, yeah.
Can everybody see my screen or not? All right, let me see if I can reshare it here. You see it now? Okay. All right, so if you're looking into the Old Testament law, especially the Torah, let me recommend a book, The Feast and Fast of Israel, Historic and Prophetic Significance. Let's see if I brought that one here. So yeah, this is a great book. Looks at the book of Leviticus, especially looks at the different offerings there in Leviticus, the holy seasons, Leviticus 3:23, and then it has Pesach, the Feast of Passover, and he deals with rabbinic laws, talks about the matzot, the 4 cups, the custom of reclining, salt water, the Seder plate. Anybody ever gone to Passover, Seder? Yeah. So sometimes Christians will have small groups. They'll actually have a Passover Seder and talk about the significance of the Passover, again, from a Jewish Messianic perspective. So he goes into all the feasts here, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of First Fruits, got major sections and commentary on each one. So highly recommend that. And the brand new commentary that's come out. Stephen Mapes very excited about this because he's writing on Isaiah. But this is Fruchtenbaum is writing several commentaries on the Old Testament, and this is the Isaiah commentary. It's just come out. And what makes his commentaries unique? Again, from a Messianic Jewish perspective, each commentary. So you're going to get how the rabbis interpret Isaiah 53. All right, so he critiques that. Dr. Mike Stallard is with Friends of Israel and writes for their magazine called Israel My Glory. He's one of our professors in our program. So if you don't get that magazine, I want to recommend that to you. Again, dealing with dispensational interpretation of Scripture. Here you have a picture of elevated Jerusalem, the millennial temple, and the water, the stream of water that will flow from the temple to the Mediterranean and to the Dead Sea. Dead Sea will no longer be dead in the millennial kingdom. So again, Ezekiel 40 to 48 talks about the future millennial temple. We actually have one of our PhD students, Ian Bacon. He's writing his research paper on presence of God in the millennium, and he's looking at the Ezekiel 40 to 48 especially. But here's a book that you'll be purchasing and reading in our 3 Hebrew Bible classes. It's the Moody Handbook of Messianic Prophecy. So to make sure that our program here focuses on the prophetic significance of the Hebrew Bible, this is a required textbook, the Moody Handbook of Messianic Prophecy. Right now, Dr. Jeremy Lyon is our professor teaching those classes, and that's a required textbook. I've talked to Jeremy about it, and the students are enjoying reading that book. So it basically looks at the Old Testament prophecies that reference the Messiah, and looks at how Jesus is the fulfillment of those. Well, let's move into rabbinic literature. And again, I'll be sharing with you some sources in Canvas. You can actually go and read these sources, but you might want to start off with this book. I don't have it in my library. I'm going to need to get it. It's called Introduction to Rabbinic Literature, Jacob Neusner. So here's some links in Canvas in week 4 modules that you're going to find some of this rabbinic literature, the Jewish Virtual Library, the Jewish Encyclopedia, but especially I highlighted Sefaria. You're going to find the Tanakh there, Talmud, Halakha, Tosefta, Mishnah, Midrash. So I would encourage you, if you've not read any rabbinic literature, you might want to take a look at that, especially if you're studying an Old Testament book. You might want to look and see, was there a Midrash on Jonah, as you're getting ready to study that. Well, let's talk about the Targums, the Aramaic Bible. 22 volumes in liturgical press. Now, I don't know if we have that in our library or have access to it, but I'm assuming that those 22 volumes actually would have the Aramaic. I don't know if it has the English translation or not. But again, in your textbook, Craig Evans has a section on the Targums, page 185 to 215. So you'll be reading about that in the textbook. So the word Targum means interpretation. And so as the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Targums are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Old Testament, and they were read in the synagogue after the reading of the Hebrew Bible. So that's what they did in the synagogue, and the reason was that the people spoke Aramaic. I've shared this with my MABT class. As you read through, for instance, the Gospel according to Mark, look for the Aramaic words of Christ that are found there, like Talitha Kumi, little girl, arise, right? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? What does it show us? It shows us that Jesus spoke Aramaic. That was the language of the first century Jew there in Israel. So the word Targum appears there, Ezra 4:7. Two most important Targums, Targum Onkelos, which is on the Torah, and Targum Jonathan on the Nevi'im, which is the prophets. The Babylonian Talmud says a person should always review his portions of Scripture along with the community, reading the Scripture twice and the Targum once. Now, in my article, The Messiah and the Torah, I don't know if I posted that for you or not. I had a section in there in the appendices where I show what Old Testament part of the Torah is read in the synagogue, in all synagogues around the world on a particular Sabbath, Shabbat. Every year, the Jews read through the Torah sequentially, and they've divided the Torah into 52 Sabbath readings, right? So you can go and read what is actually read in the synagogue. You know what particular date that's read. You can Google that, and I've posted that as part of my paper. But it's interesting to think about that whatever synagogue you go to, they're reading from the same portion of the Torah. And in the time of Jesus, because they spoke Aramaic, they would read from the Hebrew Bible, and then they would have the Targum, the Aramaic Targum that was read. Now, talking about rabbinic literature, talking about the Jewishness of the Bible, the Mishnah, here's the translation from the Hebrew, Herbert Danby, the Mishnah. Mark Strauss, in the book Four Portraits, One Jesus, required text in MABT. In Jesus' day, the teachings of the scribes were a body of oral traditions memorized and passed down from generation to generation. The rabbis claimed that this oral law, like the written law, was fully authoritative, that it was delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai. So you have the written law and the oral law. After Judaism was reconstructed or reconstituted in the decades following the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, this body of oral tradition continued to grow and develop by the rabbis. It was eventually put down into written form about AD 200, right, in the Mishnah. So the oral instruction from the rabbis put in written form, right? So comments on the Torah, on the law, found in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is an exposition of the Torah. And the word Mishnah is from the Hebrew root, Shana. It means to repeat. So teaching by repetition. So it consists of oral teachings of the rabbis codified by Judah Hanasi in the 2nd century AD after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was AD 135. So the Mishnah is divided into these sections: seeds, zaraim, laws dealing with the cultivation of the soil. Of course, you know, they had the sabbatical year. They were not to plant. You know, they could plant and harvest for 6 years, and then they were allow 1 year for the land to be fallow, not to be plowed or harvested. Of course, they broke that. Israel broke that over a course of 490 years, and that led to the 70-year Babylonian captivity. That was the reason why the captivity was 70 years, is because for 490 years, the nation of Israel didn't do that. They didn't keep the sabbatical year for the land. Festivals, the laws on the Sabbath and Israel's holy days. I just shared with you a book by Arnold Fruchtenbaum on that. Divisions of the Mishnah: one on women, Nashim, rules on marriage, divorce, family issues. Be interesting to see that. If you're doing a paper on marriage and divorce, you'd want to look at that. Damages, compensation for damages done, Nezikim. Holy things, Kodashim, laws on sacrifices, temple rituals, purifications, Torah wrote, laws regarding cleanness and purity. Of course, that was emphasized in Leviticus. All right, so we go from Mishnah to Talmud. The Talmud, the word Talmud has the idea of learning, is an interpretation and application of the Mishnah. So if the Mishnah is 200, AD 200, the Talmud is 500, 300 years later. We have two recensions of the Talmud, the Palestinian and the Babylonian. Palestinian Talmud is also called the Jerusalem Talmud, though it was produced in northern Israel, not in Jerusalem. The Babylonian Talmud is longer, is considered to be the standard. So when you say Talmud, most people think Babylonian. It's a legal rabbinic text. It includes the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Gemara is a rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was first, 200, and then you have the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah by the rabbis, right? So later rabbis commenting on earlier rabbis' interpretation of the Torah. You put the two together, Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud, right? The goal of the Talmud was to transform the whole of life with the light of the Torah as interpreted by the rabbis. Citations from the Talmud have a prefixed B. We talk about the capital Q for Qumran. Prefix B followed by the tractate name and the folio number. Oh, so B, San, would be the Sanhedrin 22. So Lightfoot, Christian, has a commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud in Hebraica. Not really read or studied that, but that would be very interested to see what he has to say about that. Neusner is a Jew, Jacob Neusner, the editor of the Talmud of the Land of Israel, 35 volumes. That's a lot for the Palestinian Talmud. Israel Epstein, editor, the Babylonian Talmud, 35 volumes. So you see how the Babylonian Talmud here, this one at least is older, 1935, 1948.
Galatians is a lot shorter.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah was written about 500. So he said Mishnah plus Gemara is Talmud. The Gemara is made up of what we call Halakha and Haggadah. Halakha is the legal section commenting on the Torah, the laws. The Haggadah is talking about the narratives. You'll be talking more about this in the Torah class. As you look at the Torah, it's not just law, right? It includes narrative. Think about Genesis, think about Exodus, right? And sermons. The Tosefta means addition. So the Tosefta refers to teaching not found in the Mishnah. The Tosefta is an addition to the Mishnah written by later rabbis. So that's why it's called an addition. Well, let's talk about Midrash and Pesher. Midrash is a type of literature, oral or written, which stands in direct relation to a fixed canonical text, considered to be the authoritative and revealed word of God by the Midrashist and his audience, and in which this canonical text is explicitly cited or alluded to. This is from Craig Evans again, in a different book, Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, which is a textbook in one of the New Testament Greek classes. So 5 characteristics of Midrash. It's a reflection or meditation on the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It's homiletical, so it's like a sermon, largely originated from the liturgical reading of the Torah in the synagogue. All right, so you would have the rabbis preaching a sermon based upon the Torah reading in the synagogue. So it's going to analyze the Old Testament text, and every effort is made in the Midrash to explain the Bible by the Bible. We call that the analogy of faith, right? Hermeneutic. Biblical message is adapted to, should say, suit the needs of the audience, and it seeks to discover the basic principles inherent in legal sections with the aim of solving problems, legal problems. So the Midrashim, is a plural ending, as you know. Midrashim are commentaries on Old Testament books written by rabbis. So the word Midrash has the idea of searching out. So the Midrash Rabbah dates from 450 to about 1110. Covers the Pentateuch, the Torah, Song of Songs, Esther, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, and Lamentations. We do have to be cautious about using the Midrashim because of later date. We should not assume that, this is what the rabbis were teaching in the time of Jesus based upon the Midrashim. Now you hear the phrase Midrash Pesher. Now Pesher is a subcategory of Midrash. So sometimes you put the two words together and you hear Midrash Pesher. So Pesher comes from an Aramaic word, means to interpret. So it's a running commentary, especially with reference to eschatological events. The focus of Pesher is explaining the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in the recent past of the commentator. So, for instance, the Habakkuk Pesher, Dead Sea Scroll. It's a commentary by the Qumran scribes on Habakkuk. Okay, so I talk about this in my paper on the doctrine of the Bible. So the Qumran community was being threatened by what group? The Romans, right? They're being threatened by the Romans because you had the Jewish-Roman War, about 66 to 73. So they're being threatened by the Romans. And so that's how they interpret the book of Habakkuk. But Habakkuk is not talking and predicting the Roman invasion. It's predicting the Babylonian invasion of Judah, right? Habakkuk is a pre-exilic prophet to Judah, predicting the Babylonian invasion. But the Qumran community reads Habakkuk, and their Habakkuk Pesher is going to interpret it as a prediction of Roman invasion. Okay, so that's a characteristic. Fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy is explained in relationship to the recent past of the commentator. All right, questions before I finish tonight talking about Old Testament archaeology? Questions on what we looked at rabbinic literature, talked about the Septuagint, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. So you're going to start reading your textbook this week, Ancient Text for New Testament Studies. All right. I encourage you to not just read that, which is a summary, but actually get into reading some of the literature itself. Take some time to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls on the Leon Levy website. Take some time to read some of the rabbinic literature from Saruria site there.
It's always very difficult for me to, even with Greek, which I'm much more familiar, to take an original document of whatever age and however it's been remastered or whatever they do to it, you know, the handwritten anything looks so different from any typeset version of the language. I've had that problem looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls before. Just what is that letter? That looks nothing like.
Yeah, the way they would write, for instance, Yod He Vav He. There was they write it in a unique way. So the alphabet itself, some of the letters from Qumran are different from the way that our modern Hebrew Bible looks. That's correct. Well, let's talk a little bit about archaeology here. Get some of my books here. So I have a paper that I wrote for the Journal of Ministry and Theology, The Battle for Old Testament History and Archaeology. So if you have an interest in archaeology, especially as it relates to being a primary source of information, as it might relate to a particular text or topic that you're studying, I encourage you to start with my paper as I talk about especially the debate between minimalists and maximalists, and come to understand a little bit of the discussion of that's going on regarding archaeology and how it's being interpreted. So we start with the whole practice of archaeology as a branch of historical research that studies the ancient past with a systematic recovery of surviving remains. Biblioarchaeology, the science of excavation, decipherment, and critical evaluation of ancient material records that relate to the Bible. I have a website, Bible Archaeology, where I regularly post pictures of various archaeological sites, artifacts that have been discovered that relate to individuals in the Bible, places in the Bible. So if you have any interest, I encourage you to join us there. So starting with the excavation of tells or mounds, just like digging through layers of civilization, like cutting through the layers of a layered cake, as they go through the various levels to get to the very bottom or the original civilization that was there. Very excited to report that plans right now in Turkey to excavate the tell of ancient Colossae. So that's sort of being discussed right now. So the value of archaeology to the study of the Bible, it's confirmed the historical accuracy of the Bible. So that's a very important point. Ancient sites, civilizations like the Hittite civilization, biblical characters like Pilate, when the Pontius Pilate inscription was found there at Caesarea. Again, we have external archaeological confirmation of the existence of Pilate. The uncovering of ancient manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably the greatest archaeological discovery of our time. And we we gained some confidence there of the accuracy of copying of the Hebrew Bible. And then just the clarification of the ancient world. As we study archaeology, we come to understand something of the culture, not only of the time of Jesus, but even before that. Well, there are some limits to the study of archaeology. It can be misinterpreted, for instance, by minimalists who reject the historicity of the text. They don't believe that Abraham was a real person. They see him as a myth. I referenced that in my article, The Battle for Old Testament History and Archaeology. They don't believe in a real Exodus or conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. They don't believe in a real King David. So archaeology for us, it's important, but it's important for us to see not everything has been uncovered. Probably less than 10% has actually been discovered. For instance, what are we going to find when the city of Colossae is uncovered? That's the excitement of it. But it is not the primary source of authority for us. The Bible is our source of authority. Randall Price, in his book, The Stones Cry Out, which is his book on Bible archaeology, he says, in the final analysis, it must be remembered that the Bible itself is our finest example of an archaeological document. While we only have a limited number of archaeological artifacts from the biblical period, the Bible represents the most complete literary record we possess of ancient times. Surviving in one form or another since its first books were penned by Moses 3,400 years ago, it remains the most accurate and trustworthy account of antiquity in the archaeological record. For this reason, it is improper to elevate other archaeological inscriptions above the biblical text in order to challenge the latter's integrity. So the debate in biblical archaeology, minimalistically, the Bible contains myths and legends. And I talk about how JEDP figures into this and their approach to not just the Pentateuch, but the whole Old Testament. Israel Finkelstein leads to a change of not only interpreting archaeological finds like those in Megiddo, but actual dates of finds. Maximalist biblical archaeologists believe the Bible is an accurate record of people and events in history. Abraham was a real person. Well, let's talk about some of the interesting discoveries as they relate. Now, I've mentioned this before, the book Readings from the Ancient Near East. So it actually has a translation. If you're interested in reading, for instance, Lou, since you're doing the creation account there as it relates to Job, you might want to read Atrahasis this week just to see what was the Akkadian account of creation and the flood that was found in Nineveh, ancient city of Nineveh, which is located in northern Iraq in 1876. It was found in the library of Ashurbanipal. He was a Assyrian ruler. And of course, it's a polytheistic account of creation. Talks about the Mesopotamian gods that created the earth, that man was created to ease the burden of labor for the gods. So again, you would want to compare and contrast. You know, what does this ancient text have to say about creation? What does it have to say about the flood? How are they similar to the creation account in Genesis as well as the flood account? And how are they different? Enuma Elish, another creation account written in Akkadian cuneiform script, 7 clay tablets, talks about a conflict between the Babylonian god Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk creates the world by splitting Tiamat, the primeval waters, into two. So it's interesting how that is described. And then we have Genesis 1-2. The Sumerian kings list gives a list of pre-flood kings with long lifespans, just like Genesis chapter 5. And in the list, there is a line that says the flood swept over. So there actually is a reference to the flood there. And of course, we have the long ages of we call the antediluvians, the people who lived before the flood, as described in Genesis chapter 5. Methuselah living to be 969 years. Then you have the Gilgamesh epic. And again, you can read the Gilgamesh epic and these other stories in the readings from the ancient Near East. Again, a Babylonian account of the flood. This epic was found in 12 Akkadian tablets. The Gilgamesh in the 11th tablet meets a man by the name of Utnapishtim, who's been called the Babylonian Noah. In the story, the god Ea warns Utnapishtim about a great flood. He's told to build a boat, but the boat has different dimensions from the boat that we find in Genesis. And the storm, rather than being 40 days and 40 nights, lasts 6 days and 6 nights. All right, so it's interesting to compare and contrast the Gilgamesh epic with the Genesis flood. I mean, for many years, back when I was taking school, they were talking about the writer of Genesis, whoever he was, because they didn't believe Moses was the author, borrowed from the Gilgamesh epic, because they said the Gilgamesh epic is older than Genesis. If you say that Moses wrote Genesis, then Gilgamesh epic precedes Moses by hundreds of years. So the argument the liberals were giving was that it was borrowed, right? But there are two different accounts, right? And I think it's important to see similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well. You're looking at the ziggurat at Ur-3. We don't know exactly what was the Tower of Babel like, but we do know that this ziggurat here, which dates to the time of Abraham, Ur-3 civilization, is this what the Tower of Babel, the base of it, looked like? See the steps that ascended? They were trying to build a tower to the heavens. Again, the ancient home of Abraham, located there in southern Iraq, right? So possible place where Abraham lived. Well, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, I referenced that in my paper. The Tomb of the Patriarchs was built by King Herod the Great. And this building, which dates to the 1st century, was built over the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried. So one of my arguments that I bring out in my paper, why would King Herod build this building over this particular cave if he didn't believe in the existence of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I think it's significant that a building of this size would be built there in Hebron. The Merneptah Stela. The Merneptah Stela is significant as it has the earliest mention of the name Israel outside of the Bible, 1207 BC. Pharaoh Merneptah celebrates his victory in Canaan and states in one of the lines, Israel is laid waste. Israel is laid waste. So you actually have an Egyptian pharaoh mentioning the word Israel. I've walked through this tunnel. It's called Warren's Tunnel. When you read 2 Samuel 5:8, that David and his mighty men took Jerusalem, right? And this is how they did it. They went through this tunnel and they were able to capture the city. The Shishonk inscription found in the temple of Karnak in Egypt records Pharaoh Shishonk's raid against a king of Judah, Rehoboam. So read about that in 1 Kings 14. So we have a record outside of Israel that corresponds to an event mentioned in the Bible. The Mesha inscription, or Moabite stone, dates to about 850 BC, describes the political relationship of Moab to Israel. The inscription was found in Dibon, the capital of Moab. Mesha boasts of his exploits against Israel, and in the inscription, he talks about the house of Omri. House of Omri, which relates to King Ahab, 1 Kings 16:28. Probably one of the more famous inscriptions, the Tel Dan inscription, found in 1993, archaeologist Dr. Baran. This is an Aramaic inscription that mentions the house of David. The house of David. And again, the significance of that as an argument against the minimalists who said that King David did not exist. So how do you have this inscription from a king who fought against the house of David, an argument for the historicity of King David? The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III dates to about 840 BC. It's a carving found in the palace of Shalmaneser, who was a king of Assyria. When you look at one of the panels, you have a king who is paying tribute. Who is that king? Well, most believe that it's a reference to King Jehu. 2 Kings chapter 17, 3-6 talks about Jehu, who was a king who paid tribute to Shalmaneser III. Another part of the panel, Israelites paying their tribute to Assyria. Hezekiah's tunnel was dug through 1,500 feet of solid rock, connecting the Gihon Spring, which was outside the wall of Jerusalem, to the pool of Siloam, which was inside the wall of the city. So we read about it in 2 Chronicles 32, 2 Kings 20. And so many tourists enjoy going through that tunnel, get an idea of the work that it must have taken to bring water into the city. Remember, Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army, and how that story of how the angel of the Lord killed 187,000, I think it was, Assyrian soldiers, and Hezekiah and Jerusalem was delivered. Speaking of protection, Hezekiah built this wall for protection from the attack by the Assyrians. It's called the Broad Wall of Hezekiah, mentioned there in 2 Chronicles. Siege ramp built by Sennacherib and the Assyrians at Lachish, and the relief of the battle for Lachish as the Assyrians began their attack against Israel, the northern tribes. Of course, they took them into captivity, 722 BC. The Sennacherib cylinder, also called the Taylor prism, describes the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib and the Assyrians. And I think the inscription says something about how Hezekiah was caged up like a bird. Mentions that in the inscription. The clay bulla, or seal of Baruch. We saw one of the pseudepigraphal books called Baruch. Baruch is the scribe of Jeremiah. He's described there in Jeremiah 36. They would have a signet ring that they would impress into clay, and that would be their seal, right? And so this is the clay boule. The boule is a discovery that's pretty small, but it has the seal from the ring of Baruch. The Babylonian Chronicles record the capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC and destruction of Jerusalem in 612. So again, we have external confirmation. The destruction of Nineveh is described in the book of Nahum. The Silver Scroll's amulet contains an excerpt from Numbers 6, 24 to 26, known as the priestly benediction. This is believed to be the oldest scripture text ever found, 400 years older than the oldest Dead Sea Scrolls. The Silver Scroll's amulet was rolled up in like a little ball, but then unfolded to reveal these verses. We finished with the Cyrus cylinder, the decree by King Cyrus, which permitted the Jews to return to their homeland to worship God in their own temple. Again, Ezra chapter 1. So all of these discoveries give us information, right? Historical confirmation of events, people, places from the Bible. So the value of archaeology. So a couple sources here. Bible and Spade is more of a conservative journal dealing with Bible archaeology, and then BAR, the Biblical Archaeology Review, a little more liberal in their perspective, but two sources there. So some of the articles that I've posted for you here in week 4 that you can include in your reading if you'd like. I'd like for you to read at least 2 of the articles, so you can choose which 2 you'd like. I think the syllabus said all of them, but I've changed it just 2. And so your assignment for this week, read 300 pages from the primary sources, Hebrew Old Testament, Septuagint, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Targums, Mishnah, Talmud, Old Testament archaeology, 2 articles that I've written there. Read the chapters from Craig Evans' book, and then write summaries. And as you read, any information that could possibly be used for your dissertation. But the summaries will help you for later research in your classes. All right, so that's the assignment for this week. Any questions? We covered tonight on Old Testament sources, Hebrew Bible. All right, next week we get into Greek sources. We'll talk about the Greek New Testament, the resources that you need to have and know how to use. We'll get into talking about Josephus. We'll get into Gnostic Gospels, Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts, New Testament archaeology. So that's what we'll cover next week. Okay. All right, let me pray for you. We'll be finished tonight. Lord, thank you for these men. Thank you for this week that we've had to look at these various sources. Thank you, God, for providing all this information for us in written form. We can read and study and help us to understand your word better. We pray that we would take advantage of these sources and that continue to guide and direct these students as in their study of the sources and as they work on their dissertation proposals, Lord. Just pray your blessing upon all of them. In In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so just a reminder that we are halfway through class. Today is week 4, so we only have 4 more classes, really 3 more content classes, and then February 28th, because tomorrow's February 1st, February 28th is our last class. That's a Monday, right? You'll be presenting your dissertation proposal. So as you're reading, as you're working on your dissertation proposal, if you get done with one assignment, go to the next. So you're going to see the assignments start to stack on each other. So just keep going, right? And recognize that once you finish on the 28th of February, you basically have 2 weeks, because from Tuesday to the end of the week is technically not spring break, and then the week after is spring break. So I know it may feel like you're being piled on here, but just recognize you're going to get a 2-week break, before you come back for your Hebrew exegesis class. So try to keep that in mind and not get overwhelmed. All right. All right. I'm praying for you. Let me know if you have any questions about the class. I'm here for you. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you.